I am meeting people. Okay. Right. Spiros, you want to get started?
Okay, so let's start. Thank you for joining this session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. Today we're pleased to have Ellen Muir, who is going to present her paper, Wage Dispersion, Involuntary Unemployment and Minimum Wages under Monopsony and Oligopsony, with Simon Loertscher. The guest panelist is Duke Kominers. The format of these seminars is as follows. We have a 60-minute presentation with time for questions from the panelists. Also if you want to talk, you can also speak during the talk. And however, we will also have the opportunity to ask questions live in the Q&A session at the end. But if you also want, you can also unmute yourself and ask questions during the talk if it is important. The talk is recorded and it's also broadcasted in the YouTube channel that we have. Before I hand over to Ellen, let me tell you this is the last talk for 2022. We're going to restart the VSET talks sometime in March. However, we also want to say that we plan to reinstate the face-to-face conference. That is sort of the precursor of these virtual seminars. And we're going to have a conference on March 2nd and 3rd in Bristol with speakers from the US and Europe to be confirmed. And everyone in our mailing list is going to receive an email with the details and put the details in our website in the following days. So that's all from me. Thank you, Ellen, for coming to give a talk, and the screen is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here presenting this project, which could alternatively be titled A Mechanism Design Perspective on Minimum Wage Policy. And this project is joint work with Simon Loertscher, who is from the University of Melbourne. So I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of what we do in this paper. In particular, what we do is we look at the optimal cost minimizing procurement mechanism of a monopsony. And the first part of the paper involves showing that this may involve wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment. And the way this will show up is that the monopsony is going to offer two wages, one wage that is above and one wage that is below the market clearing wage. The wage that's above the market clearing wage is what is going to induce involuntary unemployment, and rationing at this high wage is what is going to allow the firm to procure labor at the lowest marginal cost, subject to workers' incentive compatibility constraints. So in a nutshell, what we're showing in the first part of this paper is that the exertion of market power can be a cause of involuntary unemployment. We then think about moving on to our minimum wage analysis. And in particular, what we then do is derive the optimal procurement mechanism when this monopsony faces a minimum wage constraint. And what we show there is that a minimum wage suitably chosen can eliminate involuntary unemployment and also increase the total employment, workers' total pay, and also social surplus. So we often think of minimum wages as potentially being a cause of involuntary unemployment, but this paper is going to show that the exertion of market power can also be a cause of involuntary unemployment. And then the main policy guidance or result of this paper is then going to be looking at how it might be possible for a regulator to distinguish between these two causes of involuntary unemployment, and also to provide guidance for how to set a minimum wage appropriately. So just taking a step back and thinking about some motivation, I don't think I need to provide too much motivation for minimum wage legislation. Needless to say, this type of regulation dates back by more than a century in many OECD countries, yet it's a source of ongoing debate among economists. And in particular, economists debate the effects of minimum wage legislation on employment, involuntary unemployment, and workers' pay. But there are a few sort of standard perspectives on this in economics. So the first perspective is what we're going to call the textbook model. And This is a model where you have price-taking firms. This may arise as a result of having a perfectly competitive labour market. And in this type of model, the extent to which minimum wages have any effect, they can only cause involuntary unemployment and inefficiently low employment. But another perspective on this dates back to a textbook by Joan Robinson with subsequent papers and contributions from Stigler. And this body of work identifies that if you have monopsony power, then minimum wages do have the ability to increase workers' pay and also total employment. And then, quite famously, Card and Kruger provided empirical evidence that is consistent with the theoretical effects that Robinson and Stigler identified. And so one way of thinking about this paper is we're going to provide a new perspective on minimum wages that's going to nest these aforementioned approaches. And I think Card's Nobel address actually provides great motivation for this paper, because in his Nobel address, he talks about increasing recognition among economists that not only do firms exert market power and price setting power in output markets, but they also exert market power on input markets. And there, Card talks about the need for theoretical models that incorporate strategic interactions in wage setting. So this page basically summarizes the main sort of theorem or result in the paper. And the thought experiment that we're going to be doing here is we're going to be imagining that we have a regulator, and this regulator observes whether or not involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion occur under a prevailing minimum wage. And then what we show is that there are basically three regions that then describe the effects of a marginal increase in the minimum wage. So in the first region, which is the region sort of most novel to our paper, where we're thinking about the firm optimally using one of these two wage mechanisms, and we have therefore involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion. Here, the involuntary unemployment coupled with wage dispersion is evidence of the firm exerting market power in this input market because they're engaging in a form of wage discrimination. And in this region, if we have a small increase in the minimum wage, this is going to cause employment to increase and involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion to decrease. And these effects are all going to be a reflection of the fact that a small increase in the minimum wage is going to further curtail the market power of this monopsony employer. And this is going to be reflected in the fact that this is going to reduce their ability to engage in this form of wage discrimination. The other region is one where the regulator observes no involuntary unemployment and no wage dispersion. We refer to this as the Robinson-Stigler region of our model. But what distinguishes this region of our model from the analysis of Robinson and Stigler is that Robinson and Stigler both restrict attention to uniform wage setting. In our paper, we're always analysing the optimal procurement mechanism. And in this region of the model, it just so happens that it's optimal for the firm to offer a uniform wage. And the reason why they're doing this is because the minimum wage has curtailed their market power to the extent that they can no longer profitably engage in wage discrimination. But the fact that there's a prevailing minimum wage and we're not observing any involuntary unemployment is indicative of the fact that this firm is still exerting market power in this labour market. And in this region, a small increase in the minimum wage is going to have exactly the effects that were identified by Robinson and Stigler, and it's going to increase employment without causing involuntary unemployment. And then the final region of our model is one where the regulator observes involuntary unemployment and no wage dispersion. And we refer to this as a textbook region of the model. So here, the minimum wage is now set so high that the firm is essentially acting as a price taker now. And then in this region of the model, a small increase in the minimum wage is going to cause employment to decrease and involuntary unemployment to increase. So before yes.
Oh, sorry. Just a quick question about the sort of interpretation on that previous slide. So it sounds like you're telling us that we're going to have comparative statics, or not comparative statics exactly, but like an interpretation of the impact of a minimum wage. Is there also going to be a welfare statement sort of saying whether the social planner would prefer to institute one, sort of like offsetting whatever monopsony effect is in place?
Yes, we also have social surplus results. So in this first and second region, an increase in the minimum wage is also going to increase the total wage bill paid to workers and increase the welfare of workers, and also increase social surplus, where when we calculate social surplus, we're also accounting for the profit of the firm as well. And
Awesome.
then in the third region, not only is the welfare of the firm going to be harmed, but social surplus will also be decreasing in that region as well. So what this implies is that basically there's going to be a boundary between region 2 and region 3 where social surplus is maximized, and that will be exactly at the minimum wage, which just makes the firm act as a price taker.
Fab. Super cool. Thanks.
Okay. So just briefly talking about the related literature. So we really see this paper as being related to 3 main strands of literature. So the first is literature on efficiency wage theory. That's because the high wage that the firm is going to offer when it engages in price discrimination is going to have the flavor of an efficiency wage. It's going to discipline some of the workers into optimally electing into a wage contract where they get paid a lower wage. And in contrast to this theory of efficiency wages, previous theories, which are largely based on principal agent theories, suffer from this difficulty, which is that they rely on restrictions on the contracting space in order to generate the phenomenon of involuntary unemployment and efficiency wages. And one perspective that we could have on the first section of this paper is that it's providing a theory of efficiency wages that doesn't rely on restrictions on the contracting space. So the second strand of literature that this paper is relating to is the literature on monopsony and oligopsony pricing. So as I've alluded to previously, there's a large sort of theoretical and also empirical literature on this. And here the key distinction between what our paper is doing and what previous papers have been doing is that we're going to be looking at using tools for mechanism design to study optimal procurement. And this is going to give us scope to study the sort of interesting and non-trivial effects that minimum wages have on involuntary unemployment. So previous papers in this literature have restricted attention to uniform wage setting, and as such, they've abstracted away from these interesting involuntary unemployment effects, which are really the focus of this paper. And then finally, from a mechanism design perspective, this is really, from a theoretical perspective, this is really a paper that is using tools for mechanism design. And we're relating in particular to the mechanism design literature that looks at monopoly pricing problems that don't involve regularity. And what we're going to be bringing to this literature is we're going to study a mechanism design problem that involves a price or wage constraint. And then we're going to perform comparative statics of the optimal mechanism. And when we get there, I'll talk a little bit about how methodologically price constraints behave differently to constraints that are imposed directly on the allocation rule. Okay, so now just jumping into the setup. So the setup is extremely simple. It's essentially a textbook setup of a monopsony. In particular, we're going to imagine that we have a monopsony firm and they're going to face an inverse labor supply schedule, which we denote by a W. And the key assumption that we're going to make here is that this firm faces an upward sloping inverse labor supply schedule. We're going to microfound this upward sloping labor supply schedule by taking a previous microfoundation from the labor literature, in particular this paper by Lee and Sayers. And we're going to assume that this firm is facing a unit mass of risk-neutral workers with quasi-linear utility that can each supply 1 unit of labour. So we're focusing on the extensive margin of labour supply, which this previous literature in labour has identified as being the empirically relevant margin. So here WQ then denotes the opportunity cost of working for the worker with the Qth lowest opportunity cost. And in our mechanism design problem, each worker has private information about their opportunity cost of supplying labour. This is going to be their types in our mechanism design problem. And we're going to denote these types using the C notation once we get there in the talk. For ease of exposition, we're going to assume that W is strictly increasing and continuously differentiable. We don't actually require this for the results to go through, but things are just a little bit sort of neater and simpler if we impose this, these additional restrictions on our upward sloping inverse labour supply schedule. And then we're also going to introduce this cost function CQ. And what this cost function represents is it's specifying the cost of hiring Q workers at the market clearing wage. Absent any minimum wage regulation, and if we assume that the firm is restricted to offering a uniform wage, then this would be the cost function under the optimal procurement mechanism. But in the paper, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be generalizing away from restricting to uniform wage setting, as has been done in the previous literature, and we want to study optimal procurement. And by virtue of the assumptions that we've imposed on our upward sloping inverse labor supply schedule, we have that this cost function is strictly increasing and continuously differentiable. Okay, so then from the monopsony side of things, we're going to represent their willingness to pay for the qth unit of labor input as VQ. So, and what we're also going to do is assume that this marginal revenue product of labor function V is strictly decreasing and continuous. And we're also imposing these endpoint assumptions. And what these assumptions basically amount to is an assumption that ensures that we have a non-trivial problem where the firm doesn't want to procure either no labor or the entire workforce. So we have an interesting kind of interior problem that we're going to be solving. And there are a few different ways that we could micro-found this decreasing marginal revenue product of labor function. So one possibility could be that this firm has output power, has market power on the output market. Another possibility could be that the firm is using a production technology that exhibits diminishing returns to the labor market input, or it could be some combination of these things. Really what we're assuming here is that we're just focusing in on the firm's decision of how much of this labor market input to procure and then how to optimally procure that input. The firm is otherwise optimizing. They're optimally setting prices in the output market. They're optimally sourcing all of their other inputs. And all of this is embedded in this downward sloping marginal product of labor function.
Now, of course, and let me just quickly ask, because there are certainly conversations about minimum wages and other sort of like worker quality, sort of experience quality guarantees having impact on the actual production function and potentially even changing like, sort of the downstream structure of the market. Like you could imagine that in a universe where every employee is being paid significantly more, maybe everyone likes to go work, buy from that company instead because they know they're very humane or something like that. It sounds like a lot of that actually can be embedded in this V function. Like for example, like it would just have like a, it would have some weird curvature where if the price goes up, the labor price goes up, then like more people, then sales go up, which somehow embeds into this productivity. But is there anything we should worry about it not being able to capture?
Okay, so I think that there's, in some ways, there's probably the main thing which this model is not capturing is the possibility that workers have additional hidden characteristics that might be correlated with their marginal cost of supplying, their cost of opportunity cost of supplying labor that affects this V function. So we can think of our model as capturing one of two extremes. The firm observes every single relevant characteristic about workers aside from their opportunity cost of supplying labor, which is their own hidden type. And then we're studying the problem of how they optimally procure a given fixed type of worker where all of the other optimization that the firm is doing has been embedded in this B function. Or the other extreme possibility could be that the firm is facing this very heterogeneous pool of workers. They may be vastly different in terms of their productivity. They may have all of these different hidden characteristics that maybe the firm is, even if they can observe, maybe the firm is prohibited for legal reasons for screening over those dimensions. And what we're assuming then with the setup of our mechanism design problem is that these other characteristics are not correlated with the opportunity cost of supplying labor, which means that the firm cannot screen over these characteristics by offering differential contracts. So it's basically capturing one of two extremes where either we're sort of observing everything and then conditioning down on procuring one particular type of worker, which can be thought of just as one particular type of input into their production problem, or a world where we maybe have a lot of heterogeneity over these workers, but that heterogeneity is either unobservable or is not allowed to be screened over for legal reasons, and those things are not correlated with the opportunity cost of supplying labor.
So can I ask
Wonderful.
a clarification question here?
Yes.
There is no, in the model, there is no incomplete information.
So there's no aggregate uncertainty, but workers have private types. So when the firm is contracting with a given worker, it doesn't know what their individual type is, but it does know what the population average of the or distribution of the types looks like.
That justifies their uniform wage or something.
So what we're going to see is that even in this environment, it's still going to be optimal for the firm to use a stochastic procurement mechanism, which we're about to describe shortly. And I think this is a nice segue to talking about the form of the mechanisms that we're going to study. So without loss of generality, we can choose the representation for our procurement mechanisms that I have on this slide. So in particular, we're going to focus on direct procurement mechanisms, where we're representing the allocation rule by this function X, and then our wage schedule by this function W. Our allocation rule, as is completely standard in mechanism design, this is going to map types to their probability of supplying labor, or equivalently in this model, you can think about this as a proportion of time that a given type will spend working. Both interpretations are equally valid. And we're looking also, and the representation that we're choosing for our wage schedule is this one that maps types to the wages that they are paid, conditional on being employed. So the more standard representation would be to map the wage schedule map types to the expected wage that's paid to these types. But in this problem, because we're later going to be imposing a minimum wage constraint, this is a far better representation to choose for these direct procurement mechanisms. And choosing this representation is without loss of generality. And a mechanism that then hires a mass of Q workers, we're going to say that it involves an efficiency wage if a positive mass of workers are paid a wage that is strictly above the market clearing wage. And such a mechanism is necessarily going to induce involuntary unemployment. So by involuntary unemployment here, what we mean very precisely is that there are some workers in this market that would like to supply labor or would like to supply more labor in the case where maybe we're using this interpretation and they're spending a proportion of the time working. But the point is they would like to supply more labor at one of the wages that's being offered by the firm, but the firm is not allowing them to do so. Okay, so now I'm just going to describe how optimal involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion arise.
Quick question on that as well. So
Mm-hmm.
another way to interpret involuntary unemployment might be that there is a market clearing wage at which a worker at a firm could make a deal, which seems like somehow a stronger actually I can't tell whether it's stronger or weaker than yours. Yours seems like harder. Yours seems like it would be harder to have happen because it implies that there sort of is rationing in the market rather than there's rationing at the prices prevailing in the market rather than there's rationing overall in the sense that some workers would like to work. But I don't have a sense of whether how these compare.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I guess what I would say is that we're using this very specific definition of involuntary unemployment. And what we'll see once we get into the details in the next couple of slides is that what will be happening is that there'll just be a population of workers that are rationed at the efficiency wage. So here, another way of thinking about involuntary unemployment is that it represents rationing at the efficiency wage. Any worker who would desire to supply labor at the low wage is going to be able to gain employment at that low wage.
Yep. I see.
Okay.
I see. Cool.
So
Thanks.
in terms of just moving into this next part of the talk, the next thing which I need to introduce is this concept of convexification. So this is something that's very straightforward. The convexification of our cost function, which we're going to denote by a C lower bar. This is simply the largest cost function that's weakly less than C at every point. If our function is convex, then taking this convexification is just, of course, going to return the original cost function. Otherwise, this convexification is characterized by a disjoint set of open intervals. We're using this index M to denote this set of intervals, or to index a set of intervals. such that outside of these intervals, the cost function, the convexification of the cost function is just equal to the original cost function. And then inside these intervals, our cost function is going to be linear, and it's going to be given by taking the convex combinations of the cost function evaluated at the endpoint of these intervals. These intervals are, of course, Myerson and ironing intervals. That's a completely equivalent way of thinking about this procedure. And because of all of the assumptions that we imposed on our upward sloping labor supply schedule, we assumed that it was strictly increasing and differentiable, then we get this nice first order condition that characterizes the endpoint of these ironing intervals. And then why are we interested in this convexification procedure? Well, because this is going to be how we determine what optimal procurement looks like. In particular, if you're thinking about procuring a fixed quantity Q, the cost under the optimal, incentive compatible, and individually rational mechanism for procuring Q workers is going to be given by evaluating this convexification at this quantity of interest Q. And if we're at a quantity where this convexification is strictly less than the original cost function, then the optimal procurement mechanism will involve setting an efficiency wage that induces involuntary unemployment. And then calculating the quantity that the monopsony then optimally procures is very simple. It's just going to be the unique quantity Q that satisfies the simple first order condition, which equates the firm's marginal benefit function B with the appropriately computed marginal cost function for the firm. So it's the marginal cost under optimal procurement. So graphically, what's going on here is very simple. So this is an example of a cost function that has a single one of these convexification intervals. We started off with a cost function in red. This fails to be convex. We identify that actually it's under optimal procurement, we can do better than this non-convex cost function. We can achieve the convexification of this cost function under optimal procurement by looking at mechanisms that involve randomization or looking at stochastic mechanisms. This convexification procedure is completely equivalent to a Myersonian ironing procedure, where we have a, because we started with a cost function that wasn't convex. This implies that we started with a marginal cost function that was non-monotone. So this, of course, creates problems for our monotonicity constraint in the mechanism design problem. So what we instead do is this ironing procedure so that we end up with a monotone marginal cost function. And this then allows us to very simply identify what the optimal quantity of labor that the firm is going to procure then is. It's going to be given by the intersection between this ironed marginal cost curve and our downward sloping marginal benefit curve B. So this quantity Q star is the quantity that the firm is then going to optimally procure. So just a quick sort of side note about this. In the mechanism design literature, there is a large literature that talks about the optimality of posted price mechanisms. In some sense, we're used to thinking of this as being a very robust result. But implicitly, what is always sort of under the hood in these prior papers is an assumption that amounts to assuming that we either have nothing analogous to this downward sloping marginal benefit curve, or we have a constant marginal benefit curve. And in that case, we can never strictly benefit from using a mechanism that involves randomization. But if we have a strictly decreasing marginal benefit curve, and that intersects in the interior of one of these ironing intervals, then we do strictly better by using one of these mechanisms that involves randomization. So in terms of proving this proposition, it's really straightforward. We first explicitly construct a mechanism that procures this quantity Q at a cost that's given by evaluating this convexification at that quantity. And then the paper invokes basic mechanism design arguments to show that this mechanism is in fact optimal and it's not possible to do any better. So I'm briefly going to go through the construction of this mechanism because it introduces a lot of very useful sort of notation and terminology for us when we then move on to talking about the minimum wage analysis. So in particular, this is how the construction of the optimal mechanism is going to work. So the first case here is really trivial. If we start with a quantity where the convexification is equal to the original cost function, then the monopsony is going to simply procure these Q workers at the market clearing wage WQ. So we're going to focus on the interesting case where we're looking at a quantity Q where this convexification lies strictly below the original cost function. And this quantity will be then associated with one of these ironing intervals that we identified previously. And in particular, it'll be associated with some index M for that unique ironing interval. So we can just drop that index for the remainder of the proof, understanding that this is some fixed index, which will give rise to some fixed Q1 and Q2, which are just the endpoints of this ironing interval. And we're going to look at a mechanism that involves the monopsony setting true wages, W1 and W2. And these are going to be such that W2 is our high wage or our efficiency wage, and W1 is going to be a strictly lower wage. And then this is what we want our equilibrium construction to be. We want the firm to be hiring the Q1 lowest cost workers at this low wage W1 with certainty. And then we want the Q minus Q1 workers with costs between WQ1 and WQ2 to be hired at this high wage W2. And then we can back out what the equilibrium probability of hiring these workers at this high wage or efficiency wage is. And this is given by this fraction here, which we're labeling alpha Q. And this is going to be given by the mass of workers that the firm actually hires at the efficiency wage. This is Q minus Q1 divided by the mass of workers that attempt to gain employment at this efficiency wage, which is given by Q2 minus Q1. So alpha Q, just remember, this is the rationing probability at the efficiency wage. At the low wage, these workers are being hired with certainty. So then, given this equilibrium construction that we're after, the incentive compatibility and individual rationality constraints of the workers then pin down what the wages are. In particular, to ensure that Q2 workers participate, we need this high wage to be equal to WQ2. And then we also require that workers that have an opportunity cost WQ1 to be indifferent between gaining employment at the low wage with certainty and gaining employment at the high wage W2 with probability alpha. And if we rearrange that incentive compatibility constraint, then this is the expression that we get for the low wage. And it has this very intuitive form. It's given by a convex combination of the market clearing wage for hiring Q2 workers and the market clearing wage for hiring Q1 workers. And the weight in this convex combination is given by the rationing probability in this ironing range, or the probability that the workers successfully gain employment at this efficiency wage. And a single crossing condition then just ensures that satisfying the IR constraint for the workers with an opportunity cost applying labor of WQ2 and the IC constraint for the workers with an opportunity cost of supplying labor of WQ1 then actually induces the desired equilibrium that we identified on the previous slide. And then we can just do some really straightforward algebra to show that the corresponding procurement cost is given by this expression here. It's again very intuitive. It's given by taking this convex combination of the cost of hiring Q1 workers at the market clearing wage and the cost of hiring Q2 workers at the market clearing wage, where again, the parameter in this convex combination is exactly the probability that the workers successfully gain employment at that efficiency wage. And then by construction, this expression is exactly equal to the convexification of our cost function evaluated at the quantity of workers that this firm is trying to hire. So this part of the analysis, you could teach this to an undergraduate class. It's just extremely straightforward algebra. The only part which you wouldn't be able to teach to an undergraduate class would be the proof that it's not possible for the firm to do any better than this, that this mechanism that we've identified is in fact an optimal procurement mechanism.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes.
And I'm probably going to embarrass myself with this question, but anyway. So why would the firm not be able to? So basically here you've got two wages, and anybody who's in between that Q1, Q2 interval, you're essentially paying them less by making them work less, right? So instead of working with probability 1, you're working with a certain probability. I guess what I'm asking is, why don't you do a schedule or continuous wage schedule, which would be, could you not replicate this with a continuous wage schedule, one wage for each person in that interval, And then of course, I guess that would mean if that were possible, and I suspect it is not, you're going to tell me it is not, but if that were possible, then you wouldn't have involuntary unemployment if you interpret it as working with probability less than 1, right?
Yeah, so that would certainly be possible, but it wouldn't be optimal. So if you think about what ironing is doing, or the purpose of an ironing procedure, so you're in a situation where you're facing this. The original marginal cost curve that we started with wasn't monotone. So what this means is that ideally what this firm would like to do is identify these workers here that have a lower marginal cost of supplying labor and hire them over these workers here that have a higher marginal cost of supplying labor. But it's the incentive compatibility constraints of the workers that prohibit the firm from doing this, because these low marginal cost workers are workers that have a higher opportunity cost of supplying labor. And so the best that the firm can do when this conflict arises is just hire each of these workers with uniform probability and pay them a uniform wage. So certainly you could offer any continuous wage schedule that doesn't violate the incentive compatibility constraints of the workers, but that's not going to be optimal, because any such incentive compatible mechanism is going to put higher weight on hiring these workers with a higher opportunity cost of labor a higher marginal cost of supplying labor, when the precise purpose of an ironing procedure is to ensure that we're hiring these low marginal cost workers with as high a probability as we possibly can without violating the incentive compatibility constraints of the workers. So it's this conflict between this failure of monotonicity and the monotonicity constraint that arises from the from the incentive compatibility constraints of the workers that is giving rise to this procurement mechanism being optimal.
I think what I was missing is that I was imagining that the alpha was a function of the types, but it's actually a function of the quantity, which is the problem. Yeah, okay.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. Again, we could make the alpha a function of the types, but it would just have to be a function that's not violating the incentive compatibility constraints, which would mean that it would have to be a decreasing function, which would generate less. It would generate a higher total cost for the firm.
Yeah.
So before I move on to the minimum wage section, I just wanted to talk a little bit about implementation in this environment. So what we've focused on when we introduced this class of direct mechanisms that we're studying is an ex post implementation, where what we mean here is that the firm, so we're looking at stochastic mechanisms because stochastic mechanisms are optimal. And what the firm is doing in this ex post implementation is it's doing the randomization after workers have made a report or made a decision. In particular, what the firm is doing is they're simultaneously posting these two wages, this low wage W1 and this high wage W2. It's then allowing the workers to sort or self-select. And after the workers have sorted or self-selected, then the firm is going to ration the workers that have attempted to gain employment at this high wage. An alternative implementation would be this ex ante implementation. In some ways, a lot of people who work in this area would think about this as being the more natural representation, because you can always represent any incentive compatible mechanism as a convex combination of posted price mechanisms. And under this representation, we get this very natural ex ante implementation where the firm does the randomization before it asks any worker to make a decision, and then it just makes every worker a take it or leave it offer. So under this implementation, what the firm would do is it would offer every worker a wage of WQ1 with probability alpha, and then every worker a wage WQ1 with probability 1 minus alpha. This will generate exactly the same equilibrium that this ex post implementation is generating. And it also has the advantage of endowing workers with dominant strategies. But once we get to the minimum wage analysis, I'll explain why we don't use this ex ante implementation in this paper. It's also possible to use a dynamic dominant strategy implementation. You could fill your Q1 vacancies first at the low wage, and then you can hire Q minus Q1 workers at a higher wage of W2. So there are lots of different ways of implementing these stochastic mechanisms. And as I alluded to earlier, part-time work is also an alternative interpretation which would not require any randomization. In the part-time implementation, what the firm would do is it would pay full-time workers an hourly wage of W1, and then it would offer part-time workers alpha fraction of a full-time job, and it would pay them an hourly wage that's given by W2. So the way this would show up is a world in which the firm is paying part-time workers a higher wage than full-time workers. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to click on this go-to button, but this go-to button provides empirical evidence of firms paying workers who have an identical job description a higher wage if they're a part-time worker and a lower wage if they're a full-time worker. And then just a few words on monopsony power and non-regularity. As I was alluding to earlier, there is growing consensus among economists that firms are exerting wage setting power on input markets, as has long been recognized in output markets. This regularity assumption here, it's showing up in the form of the firm facing a procurement cost function that's non-convex. Equivalently, the way that this would show up in an output market is that the firm would face a revenue curve that fails to be concave. That particular assumption has been tested empirically for output markets. And when this assumption is tested in output markets, it's regularly rejected. And the hypothesis that's been put forward as to why regularity is often rejected in output markets is because irregularities very naturally arise when you're aggregating over groups of relatively heterogeneous consumers. So the way that this might show up in a labor market would be if you have some workers that say only start to supply labor to this firm if the firm offers a sufficiently high wage to cover their commuting costs. Maybe once the firm hits a certain wage, suddenly it's going to expand its commuting zone and more workers will then be willing to work for the firm and it'll expand the labor market it can access. Or maybe some workers will only start to supply labor once they've covered, say, childcare costs. So these kinds of effects cause failures of regularity or cause non-convexities to arise in cost functions. So this is a hypothesis that has been put forward in output markets, and I don't see any reason why this should systematically hold in input markets.
Let me ask a question about that though. So the contexts you just described are both ones that are typically not associated with minimum wage jobs. Right, like the expanding commuting zones by like adding buses to get to the office is like a feature of software engineering and like other like very high skill firms. Usually like also like firm provided childcare comes with like higher skill jobs and not like lower income wage jobs. So like, should we be worried about regularity specifically around the minimum wage sort of range?
No, so I don't think so. So I think so. A lot of minimum. So this is not necessarily the firm, say, providing a bus for workers or covering childcare costs. This is just that the firm is offering a slightly higher wage, and now workers.
I see, enough of a wage that now people can afford to do this additional thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And
interesting.
So, and if you think about, say, the $5 wage that Ford paid, then that was exactly the purpose of offering that higher wage. It was to
that makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Migrate to Detroit. Yeah, exactly.
And one question. But if I understand well how the ironing in your model works, what you would expect is to see that the iron occurs precisely between two different groups of the ones that are creating the irregularity, right?
Yes.
Which is empirically testable, I guess.
Yes, it's empirically testable. I just don't know of anybody. I know people have tested this in the context of output markets. I don't know specifically of a paper that's tested this in the context of labor markets. I would hope that maybe this paper would provide motivation for people to think about this assumption in the context of labor markets.
Thank you.
Let me stick with this regularity question for a second. So do we have, so Henry Ford is a good example, but like, do we have like broad evidence either do we have broad evidence that firms today are thinking about this, or, I mean, have we seen initiatives? You can imagine like in addition to minimum wage initiatives, there could be like, commuting wage initiatives, right? Like something that very specifically targets the problem of like giving people extra money on the margin if they're commuting from a further distance or something like that. Have we seen anything like that? I mean, and no worries if this like is out of scope, but like it seems like this would imply some like very specific policies that we should see.
Yeah. So we haven't looked at this specifically. We found this assumption being tested in output markets, and we have evidence of the kind of empirical evidence of the type of wage structure that I'm describing being offered in many firms across the US. But we haven't done like a specific, empirical analysis where we've tried to identify whether or not the effect that we're talking about here is one that's driving the patterns. We've just proposed a theory, which is explaining why firms might offer something like an efficiency wage, and we're describing. And we think the theory is testable because we're basing it on two things which we think might be reasonable for a regulator to observe. So involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion. And I think it's fair to say that people in the labor literature haven't thought about this particular problem or a particular model for a labor market of exactly this form. But I think that there would be scope to empirically test this theory.
Super interesting. And am I right that like a policy of the form, mandate essentially like a wage bump for people who have to commute from further distances, or like mandate a credit for people who need to have childcare expenses or something like that would also partially address the problem? Or is that like actually still not optimal under this frame? I can't tell whether it's within the scope of the actual design framework.
Yeah, so I suppose so that's those kinds of comparative statics are not, or that type of analysis is not something that we've done in this paper in particular. But if I draw on our previous JP paper that looks at the monopoly pricing version of this problem, if you were to offer those kinds of if you think about it as a regulator or as a policymaker offering those kinds of subsidies, not the firm doing it itself, but an outside person offering these kinds of subsidies, what this would do is I guess it would remove it would sort of regularize the upward sloping supply curve that the firm is facing. And then what I would say based on our previous paper is that could actually backfire on
exactly. Yeah, you're totally right. That could somehow that restores the monopsony power. It makes it stronger somehow.
Yeah. So what it will do is it'll make setting a market clearing wage optimal for the monopoly, or for the monopsony in this case. And what we looked at in the previous paper, which was in the context of thinking about resale markets, is that if you impose a policy that's inducing the firm to move back to just offering market clearing wages, for example, if the firm faces in the output market context, when the firm was facing a highly effective resale market, this can actually backfire and result in the firm hiring far fewer workers than it was previously. So you could actually make both workers and the firm worse off potentially with these kinds of policies. So I guess what I will say is that, our usual intuitions from economics, where we often come from having market clearing prices, even in the presence of market power. And once you move away from that and start looking at these sort of irregular models where you have multiple wages being offered in equilibrium, then a lot of intuition which we might usually have doesn't just automatically kind of carry through.
Super interesting. I mean, that seems like a really interesting implication you might want to like go so far as to draw out formally here, right? Because like I know there's lots of work on these policies that are specifically targeting individual cost differences, and your point is that like in equilibrium that could cause an adjustment that could actually make everyone worse off. That's super cool.
Yeah, it would of course depend on the degree of
course, yeah,
in the labor market. But yes, that's and I think that again that would be something which would be basically combining results in our earlier paper with the analysis that we've done in this paper, but it's not something that's explicitly in the current paper.
Yep, super cool. Thanks.
So then I suppose, because I'm now running really low on time, I think I'll just go through a very brief overview of the minimum wage analysis. So what we've shown in the, aforementioned in the previous section of the talk is that minimum wages are often perceived as a cause of involuntary unemployment, but we've just shown that market power can also be a cause of involuntary unemployment. And then the second section of the paper is really focused on showing that minimum wages can not only increase employment, as noted by Robinson and Stigler, but they can also decrease and even eliminate involuntary unemployment. And before I sort of go into giving an overview of the results in this section of the talk, I just need to introduce a little bit more notation. I'm going to let QP denote the efficient quantity of workers that the firm would hire if it was acting as a price taker. That quantity satisfies a simple first order condition that includes this quantity WQP, which you can think of as the sort of efficient wage that would arise in this labor market if the firm was acting as a price taker. And then we don't do this in the paper, but just now for ease of exposition, I'm going to assume that wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment occur under the laissez-faire equilibrium absent any wage regulation. And in particular, what that means is that the optimal quantity of workers that the firm hires is going to lie strictly in the interior of one of our ironing intervals, which is going to be indexed by some index M. And I'm also going to introduce this notation, this W1 Q star notation, which is denoting the low wage that's paid under the laissez-faire equilibrium. So then introducing a minimum wage has certain level effects. So here what we're doing is a thought experiment. We're imagining that the regulator just observes an economy that's in a laissez-faire equilibrium, and then they're trying to make a decision as to what level of minimum wage they should introduce. So this is broken down into three parts. The first part is really simple and intuitive. Let's suppose that somehow this regulator could say, estimate the iron marginal cost curve of this firm. They could also estimate their downward sloping marginal benefit curve, and they had a way of estimating this efficient wage, this WQP wage. If the firm introduces a minimum wage exactly equal to that efficient wage, it's going to have the following effects. It's going to increase the equilibrium employment to QP. It's going to increase workers' total pay. It's going to eliminate involuntary unemployment and wage dispersion. And it's also going to maximize total employment and social surplus. So I think that those effects are all very kind of intuitive. The second bullet point in this proposition then says, hang on a minute, maybe it's not possible for a regulator to actually estimate all of these things and identify what this what this sort of best choice of minimum wage actually is. But let's imagine that they can observe the range of wages that the firm is offering under the laissez-faire equilibrium. If they choose any minimum wage in that range, which includes imposing a minimum wage that's equal to the previous efficiency wage that is just given by this WQ2 expression, then this will have the following effects. Relative to the laissez-faire equilibrium, it will increase total employment and total workers' pay. It will decrease involuntary unemployment, and it will also increase social surplus. So relative to the status quo, by introducing any minimum wage in this range, the regulator can make everyone better off, except of course for the firm. And then if we have a minimum, and then one thing though about this highest minimum wage of the efficiency wage, it's better than the status quo of having no regulation, but it may be sort of too high or too low in the sense that we may be above the efficient wage or below the efficient wage. And we can tell this by thinking about whether or not this minimum wage successfully eliminates involuntary unemployment. So it's possible you may overshoot or undershoot the desired minimum wage by using this very extremal choice of setting the minimum wage equal to the efficiency wage. But then the following set of results, this schematic summary of our marginal effects, then gives guidance as to how a regulator can optimally identify if they've set a minimum wage that's too high or too low, and then make optimal incremental adjustments to the minimum wage. And that's what we have on this slide. So it's providing a sort of a schematic summary where we're doing this thought experiment where we're imagining that we're starting in a region where we have a very low minimum wage. It's not binding. And then we're gradually increasing this minimum wage, making it higher and higher and higher. By assumption, we're starting off in a region where we have the firm optimally using wage dispersion and generating involuntary unemployment. Eventually, the minimum wage will hit a point where it starts to bind. Once we're setting a minimum wage that's below the low wage that was offered before, then what this is going to do is it's going to start to curtail the market power of this firm. And initially, the way this is going to show up is it's going to cause an increase in employment, a decrease in involuntary unemployment, and it's also going to compress the wage schedule, both from above and below. So intuitively, what's going on in this red region of our model is that the firm's market power has been curtailed and they can't as effectively engage in this wage discrimination, but they still get some benefit from engaging in wage discrimination. So it's showing up still, but we're in a region where as you keep increasing the minimum wage and it gradually curtails the market power of the firm, it's gradually reducing the extent to which it engages in this wage discrimination. Eventually you get to a point where we enter what we call the Robinson and Stigler region. So this is where the market power of the firm has been curtailed to an extent that it no longer profitably benefits from engaging in wage discrimination, but it's still exerting market power in the output market. And that's identified by having no involuntary unemployment and no wage dispersion at a prevailing minimum wage. And eventually we get to a point where we hit this efficient wage and then we pass into our textbook region. So this is where we've set a minimum wage that in some sense is too high because we've passed beyond the wage that maximizes total employment and social surplus. And now we're moving into a world where the firm is acting already as a price taker. And as you continue to increase the minimum wage, now you're just decreasing total employment and increasing involuntary unemployment. So basically we get this transition between regions that represent differential degrees of market power of this firm. And the way we can identify whether a minimum wage is causing involuntary unemployment from whether market power is causing involuntary unemployment is by looking at whether or not that involuntary unemployment is accompanied by wage dispersion. And then this slide here, this theorem, is basically then just giving us a formal statement of exactly the policy summary that I had in the introduction of the talk, where we're basically can look at using wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment to condition in being in one of these three regions, and then making a policy recommendation for the regulator in terms of the direction in which it should start to adjust to the prevailing minimum wage. So I think I've kind of run out of time to really do justice to this last section of the talk. So I think I'll just briefly talk about this slide because it does relate back to the implementation that I was discussing earlier, where we focus on this ex post implementation in the paper. And the reason why we do this is basically summarized on this slide. So for convenience, I'm just going to introduce one additional piece of notation, which is I'm going to introduce this notation S to denote our labor supply schedule. So if we for now restrict attention to uniform wage setting, as has been done previously in the literature, then we can identify the cost of procurement for the firm under the optimal mechanism subject to the restriction to uniform wage setting and under a minimum wage of W lower bar. And in that case, this cost of procurement is going to be really simple. If we're at a quantity, which means that we have a constraint or a minimum wage constraint that is tight, then the best that the firm can do under uniform wage setting is just setting a wage that's equal to the minimum wage. So their cost of procurement is simply going to be given by multiplying this minimum wage by the quantity that of labor that the firm is hiring. And then once we're outside this region where the minimum wage constraint binds, then this cost of procurement is just simply given by our original cost CQ. So, but what we actually need to do in this paper is answer the question, what is the cost of procuring a fixed quantity of Q units under a fixed minimum wage W lower bar when we're using optimal procurement? So in this case, you cannot calculate this by simply taking the convexification of this cost function when we're looking at restricting attention to uniform wage setting. So we were able to do this in the case where we didn't have a minimum wage constraint, but this is not going to work in the case where we have a minimum wage constraint. And the reason is that the designer can still separate types that have a cost that's less than or equal to this minimum wage once we start looking at random mechanisms. When we're focusing on uniform wage setting, it is not possible for the designer to do this separation. But it turns out that when you can cleverly construct lotteries that don't violate the minimum wage constraint, but still separate types that are less than this minimum wage by offering two wage mechanisms, and you can do strictly better. And the reason why this arises is because in this problem, the choice of allocation rule matters, the choice of the representation for our allocation matters when we have constraints that are imposed on the transfers. So previous literature that have looked at constrained mechanism design problems have looked at problems where you're imposing constraints directly on the allocation rule. And so there you work with this very natural canonical representation where you think of any incentive compatible mechanism as being able to be represented by a convex combination of posted price mechanisms. And you have this very natural ex ante implementation where you think about randomizing over these posted price mechanisms. And we discussed this implementation much earlier in the talk. But it turns out that minimum wage constraints are tighter under this ex ante implementation, because this requires that this wage here, this WQ1 wage, is less than or equal to our minimum wage. Whereas our ex post implementation, where the designer posted these two wages and then asked workers to source into their desired wage contract, this has a slacker constraint, because this is only requiring that this convex combination is less than or equal to our minimum wage constraint. So I guess the first step in this proof is actually working out which representation is without loss of generality when we're imposing constraints on transfers instead of imposing constraints on allocations. And it turns out that it's this ex post implementation, which is maximizing the minimum wage that the firm is paying to the workers. And so it's this ex post implementation that we can focus on without loss of generality. And then once we've done this, then we use a dual approach to then solve our mechanism design problem. And we basically need to work out how to identify what the appropriate envelope is for the marginal cost schedule of the firm under the optimal mechanism. We can then identify which regions we're getting the different forms of the optimal mechanisms that I discussed before, whether it's rationing at the minimum wage, setting the minimum wage as a market clearing wage, or this red region where you have wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment in equilibrium, but a binding minimum wage. And then we can trace out how our marginal benefit curve and the intersection of this with our marginal cost curve changes as we vary the minimum wage, which shifts this envelope of the marginal cost schedule under the optimal procurement in the face of a minimum wage. And then this is what allows us to trace out these paths of how each of these observables change as we have an increase in the minimum wage. And then one thing which I've sort of swept under the carpet is that in general, things are a little bit more complicated in that we may have, multiple ironing ranges. Under the laissez-faire equilibrium, we might not necessarily start out in an ironing range. So you can get this sort of quite complex behavior where we might alternate between regions with wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment and a Robinson-Stiegler region. But it's always the case that our Robinson-Stiegler region is one that we enter before we get to this textbook region. So the way you always enter an ironing range is one where you have wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment being generated. And the only way to get out of an ironing range again is via one of these Robinson and Stiegler regions. So then just to conclude, this paper uses tools from mechanism design to develop a new theory of wage dispersion and involuntary unemployment, and then the corresponding effects of minimum wage regulation. In the paper, we also consider an extension to allow for horizontally and vertically differentiated workers and jobs. And then we also look at a model where firms engage in Cournot competition. And in future work, we're interested in teasing out more of the IO implications of this model, particularly in our model with horizontal differentiation. There's really interesting scope to study things like merger synergies that don't involve contractual restrictions, and then also there's scope to study more general regulation instruments beyond having a minimum wage. In this type of environment, it's possible that introducing a maximum wage can also benefit workers, because this is another tool that the designer could use or a regulator could use to restrict the firm's ability to engage in wage discrimination. And that's all I have. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellen. Scott, do you have any final remarks before I ask the other attendants?
Sure, and I'll be reasonably brief because I know I got a lot of questions in during the talk itself. But first of all, I just want to say this is like an incredibly cool paper. And in particular, you know, you have this whole agenda where you're bringing mechanism design to, like, you know, try and understand like the fundamentals of pricing, you know, sort of like the pricing we see in markets, and try and understand those better by, like, you know, asking like what happens if there are actual irregularities in the underlying distributions. And it continues to be something that, like, amazes me as just how powerful it is. I definitely want to push to, like, you know, like every way you can take this to something empirical or even just like anecdotal about like sort of policies people have promoted, super valuable. I'm particularly curious whether, you know, policy regulators try and test for monopsony, right? They sort of like try and like measure monopsonistic behavior. I wonder whether the predictions you have about this like sort of transition diagram actually sort of could induce something that would look like a monopsony test as well, right? Somehow, like, you know, if you see this type of wage dispersion, like, is it enough to say we measure wage dispersion and see involuntary unemployment and, like, aha, like, you know, now regulators should be concerned, or is there more to it than that? And then maybe just like one other footnote is I would love to understand how we think, you know, letting sort of generalizing on this question, because you've blown my mind with this observation that the, like, you know, wage accommodation policies might actually make everyone worse off. So, like, I'd love to see that actually develop. Like, if you have the, you know, it seems like it'd be cool. But also, like, I wonder more broadly, to the extent that policymakers have the ability to influence the cost distribution or that V function, right, or sort of like how the market responds to changes in the firm's, like, you know, labor productivity, like, can we get from this to a general theory of what decisions policymakers should make on that? Anyhow, sorry, those are two meta questions that probably don't have concrete answers, but you know, I love the paper, love the talk, and that's what I'd be thinking about next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think in general, another direction which we're sort of interested in potentially taking this, and I think that this probably speaks to, you know, your comments about pushing this further towards doing sort of empirical tests, would be to have a model that not only has these sort of mechanism, design, and market power effects, but then also incorporate something like frictions as well. And then I think a really interesting question empirically is, when we observe things like involuntary unemployment in practice, what role might frictions also be playing in that? And is there a way to distinguish frictions and market power and involuntary unemployment that may be caused by a minimum wage? And I think my thoughts along those lines are that if frictions are causing or if frictions are driving involuntary unemployment, and wage dispersion, then you shouldn't observe the same level effects that we observe in our model, where these things start to systematically decrease in response to, say, increases in the minimum wage. So I think that could be one way of empirically distinguishing these things. And I think if there was interest from a labor audience and kind of demand for that paper, then that's one that I would be interested in writing as well, but probably only if it was very, very much geared towards, say, an empirical labor audience. So I think if people find this paper sort of interesting, and if we get sort of traction with this paper, then that's something which I think I would be interested in looking at as well, empirically.
Super cool. Thanks.
Okay, any questions from other people?
I can ask a speculative question. You mentioned something about output markets.
Mhm.
You know, the natural question is empirical as well.
Mhm.
Is there anything like that in the monopoly selling to general public?
Yes, yeah. So I guess so Simon and I have a paper that on monopoly pricing in these with these kinds of irregularities that came out in JPE earlier this year. And in that paper, our leading example is thinking about markets like ticket markets, where you often see sort of premium versions of a good being priced at a very, very, very high price where you don't get rationing at that price. And then the rest of the goods are sold in sort of a mass market at a much lower price where it looks like there's systematic underpricing. And then one thing we focus on in that paper, which we abstract away from in this paper, is the incentives that then provides for a resale market. Because when you do this kind of rationing, then there's going to be some consumers that have a higher value for the good that get rationed, and other consumers that have a lower value for the good that actually win this lottery and succeed in purchasing a ticket. And that creates incentives for speculators to then enter that market and for a secondary market to then be created. And so in that paper, we provide sort of empirical evidence for irregularities actually arising in practice in these markets. And then we do a calibration exercise where we calibrate our model to ticket markets where we have summary statistics that summarize the primary and secondary market trade. And then what we show is that that model that we put forward can actually very easily rationalize the pricing decisions in the primary market, which people have often viewed as being puzzling and something that you can't explain with sort of standard economics. And then also the type of distribution prices that you see in secondary markets. And I think the intuition that I think a lot of people have previously had is that it's very difficult to rationalize spectacularly high resale prices with optimal price setting in primary markets. And what that paper shows is actually you can rationalize all of these things on the equilibrium path. You can see a seller that sets non-market clearing prices that then endogenously gives rise to a resale market, and even exorbitantly high prices in the resale market don't necessarily contradict the optimality of the primary market mechanism that the seller was using. So that paper kind of explores this idea in a lot of detail in output markets. And then this paper is looking at, okay, what happens if we now turn to input markets? And two things which we didn't look at in the monopoly pricing paper were price regulation in these kinds of environments. And we also didn't look at competing sellers. So this paper adds both of these things. So it looks at beyond the extremal case of having a monopsony, this looks at the case where you have N employers that are competing for workers in this market where the upward sloping labor supply schedule gives rise to a market level cost function that fails to be convex. And then it also thinks about, well, what happens if we do something like impose price regulation? What scope is there for that to not only increase the quantity that the either monopoly is selling or the monopsony or the quantity of workers that the monopsony is hiring, but what are the welfare effects of also eliminating the price discrimination that either the monopsony or the monopoly or the wage discrimination that the monopsony is engaging in. So looking at these two, this paper, you can immediately invert the results and then it will immediately carry over to the monopoly pricing version of the problem where you have a price ceiling.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I ask a more down-to-earth question? In slide 20, which was your main picture of the different regions. So when there is this region where you still engage in these two prices, the one above and the one, even though the minimum wage starts to constrain, basically. So clearly, the ones that were paid less now benefit from an increase in their wage, but the ones who were paid more, the wage decrease, so the wages start to converge.
Yes.
So at some point Scott asked you about welfare, at least consumer welfare. Can we say something about whether overall this benefits the workers or not?
Yes. So we do have that in the paper. So overall, the workers benefit, and if it was a 75-minute seminar, I would have kept in an extra slide that we have on redistributive effects of minimum wages, which you've exactly alluded to. So when you're in this region where you have the firm engaging in this wage discrimination, it's true that there may be some workers who end up being worse off as a result of the increase in the minimum wage, because the efficiency wage is going to fall. It's actually a little bit more sort of complicated in the sense that we can show that all the workers are better off overall. In general, we can't rule out these redistributive effects, but it's actually not clear without doing a lot of analysis for a specific example, whether or not those workers that get paid the lower efficiency wage are actually better off or worse off in equilibrium, because there's this countervailing effect, especially if you want to use, say, the part-time interpretation, which is that the rationing probability increases because the firm hires more workers in equilibrium. And coupled with that decrease in the efficiency wage is also a shrinking of that ironing region. So more workers are getting hired. There's a smaller pool of workers that are competing for this now lower efficiency wage. And so it's actually not clear whether the workers that gain employment at the efficiency wage before and after the change in the minimum wage are actually better off or worse off in equilibrium. So
It could even be a Pareto improvement from a worker's perspective.
Yes, so there's a Pareto improvement from a worker's perspective. There's also potentially these redistributive effects depending on the race between the changes in the wage schedule versus the changes in the employment probability. But generically, there are going to be these sort of redistributive effects that are associated with the minimum wage, because some workers benefit from the fact that the firm is basically using them as a punishment device for the workers that are optimally selecting into these low wage contracts. The fact that some workers get employment at the efficiency wage is actually potentially harmful to other workers that are then forced to select into this lower wage contract in equilibrium.
This is very close. Sorry, go ahead.
So no, I was just going to sort of follow up on that, because one of the things, we're in British academia, and one of the things that is interesting here is that unions tend to focus very much on not what I would call a minimum wage, but in bargaining, they tend to focus on maximizing the benefit for, they're kind of Rawlsian. I don't know how else to put it. They certainly don't bargain for the superstars and so on. And I'm wondering whether your model to some extent speaks to that there might be losers here, not just winners. Sounds like it depends on, the parameter details. You're saying overall, of course, welfare measure here is, number of people times increase and so on. So, but I had that in mind. That was what I had in mind. And it sounds like it may or may not actually happen, because then, on the other hand, you don't have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of productivity. So this is difficult to sort of, if you had that workers also not just at an opportunity cost, but also a type in terms of productivity, then you might be able to address that question a bit more, right?
Yes, and that's something which, again, we do look at it in the paper, but I didn't talk about today, which is that we also look at vertically differentiated jobs and workers, and then we can think about how changes. So if the minimum wage is binding for the lowest sort of lowest types, then we can think about how that cascades then through the wage schedule for the rest of the workers, and then we can get some really interesting kind of non-intuitive effects.
Because I'm thinking, for example, it could be that if it does reduce, suppose it did reduce the wage schedule, those at the top of the wage distribution, you might have some other effects on overall productivity of a system, right? Because top British academics could get better jobs in the United States, for example, right? So, it's that kind of thing that I have in mind. Anyways, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so I think now we can stop the broadcast and the official part, and we can just talk for a couple of minutes, just unofficially. So, Ellen, it was a very nice talk. Thank you very much for coming, and also Scott for